I'm Charlotte Bennett, 32, and my family's Christmas Eve dinner turned into a nightmare that exposed years of deception. When Grandpa Jack innocently asked about the house he'd supposedly gifted me, everyone froze. $480,000 is a lot to give one grandchild. Dad, my Aunt Margaret muttered. I stared at my mother, Janet, whose face had gone pale. The silence felt suffocating as realization dawned on me. My mother had kept Grandpa's gift, my inheritance, and let me struggle through student loans and rent for years. Little did I know, this revelation would unravel our family's darkest secrets. If you've ever experienced that moment when family secrets come crashing down around you, drop a comment about where you're watching from. I still can't believe how one innocent question at Christmas dinner changed my entire life. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear how I discovered my mother's web of lies and how karma finally caught up with her. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming. Growing up, I was always Grandpa Jack's favorite. He was the patriarch of our family, a self-made businessman who built his fortune from nothing. Every Sunday, he'd pick me up in his old Cadillac, and we'd go for ice cream where he'd tell me stories about his childhood during the Depression. Charlotte, he'd say, tucking a $5 bill into my pocket, always save for rainy days. But remember, money is just a tool, not a treasure. Those words would become painfully ironic later in my life. Our family had a clear hierarchy. Grandpa Jack at the top, then his 3 children. My mother Janet, my uncle Richard, and my Aunt Margaret. Richard was the responsible one who joined Grandpa's business. Margaret was the creative free spirit who opened an art gallery with Grandpa's financial backing. And then there was my mother, Janet the shrewd one, always calculating, always planning. Growing up, I thought her constant focus on money was just good financial sense. Despite Grandpa's obvious wealth, he lived in a sprawling Victorian house in the best part of town. Our family lived modestly. Mom insisted we needed to earn our own way and not rely on Grandpa's money. I wore second-hand clothes while my friends had designer labels. I worked part-time jobs from age 16 while my cousins received new cars on their birthdays. When I questioned this disparity, Mom would say, "We're building character, Charlotte. Your cousins will never learn the value of hard work." I believed her. I really did. College was a struggle. While my cousins attended private universities with their tuition fully paid, I juggled 3 part-time jobs to afford state college. I took out student loans that would haunt me for years. When I asked Mom if Grandpa might help with tuition, she scoffed. "We don't take handouts in this family, Charlotte. Grandpa believes in self-sufficiency." I later discovered this was the first of many lies. After graduation, I met Kyle, a kindergarten teacher with a heart of gold and student loans that matched mine. We married young, combining our debts and dreams in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in the worst part of town. Kyle and I scraped by, putting small amounts into savings each month, hoping to someday afford a down payment on a modest home. The housing market in our area was brutal, with even starter homes selling for $350,000 or more. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad moved into a larger house. Mom started wearing designer clothes and taking luxury cruises with Dad twice a year. When I asked how they could afford it, Mom vaguely mentioned smart investments. I was happy for them, but confused why they never offered to help us, especially when our car broke down or when Kyle needed emergency dental surgery that wiped out our savings. Things got worse when I lost my marketing job during company downsizing. For 6 months, I struggled to find new employment while Kyle's teacher salary barely covered our bills. Our apartment rent increased by 15% that same year. When I approached Mom about possibly borrowing money just until I found a new job, she lectured me about financial responsibility. "You should have saved more for emergencies," she said, sipping from a crystal glass that I knew cost more than our monthly grocery budget. "Your father and I worked hard for what we have. No one ever gave us handouts." I left her house in tears that day, feeling like a failure. Kyle held me that night as I cried, assuring me we'd get through this together. We always did. The next week, I landed a new job with slightly better pay, and we celebrated by splurging on takeout Chinese food, our version of luxury. Throughout these struggles, Grandpa Jack's health began to decline. At 85, his once sharp mind started showing signs of memory loss. Some days, he'd repeat stories. Other days, he'd call me by my mother's name. It broke my heart to see him deteriorating. The family decided it was best to move him into an assisted living facility, a beautiful place with gardens and activities, but it wasn't home. Mom took charge of his care, of course, insisting on handling all his finances and healthcare decisions. "Don't worry about a thing, Dad," she'd say. "I'll make sure everything is taken care of." I visited Grandpa frequently, bringing homemade cookies and fresh flowers for his room. Sometimes he was lucid, asking detailed questions about my life. Other times, he seemed confused about why he was there. During one visit, he asked if I was enjoying the gift he had given me. But before I could ask what he meant, he started talking about his childhood again. I didn't think much of it at the time. As Christmas approached, Mom announced we'd host the annual family dinner at her house instead of Grandpa's, as had been tradition. "It's too much to move Dad for the evening," she explained. "His doctor thinks familiar surroundings are best right now." I had no reason to doubt her. No reason at all to suspect that in a few days, a simple question from Grandpa would tear our family apart. The Bennett family Christmas Eve dinner had always been an elaborate affair, but this year, Mom had outdone herself. Her dining room gleamed with crystal glasses and fine china. The centerpiece, an arrangement of white roses and holly berries, must have cost hundreds. Mom wore a new red designer dress and diamond earrings I'd never seen before. Everything about the evening felt extravagant. Aunt Margaret arrived with her husband Steve and their twins, Jessica and Jennifer, both home from their Ivy League universities. Uncle Richard came with his wife Deborah and their son Nathan, who'd just returned from a semester abroad in France. All my cousins looked tanned, well-dressed, and carefree, a stark contrast to Kyle and me in our best clothes that were at least 5 years old. Grandpa Jack arrived last, brought by his caregiver Susan from the assisted living facility. He looked smaller than I remembered, his once imposing frame now fragile in a wheelchair, but his eyes lit up when he saw me, and he insisted I sit next to him at the table. "There's my Charlotte," he said, squeezing my hand. "Always my favorite." Dinner began pleasantly enough. We passed dishes of honey-glazed ham, roasted potatoes, and green beans. Mom kept the wine flowing as conversation drifted between Jessica's internship offers and Nathan's adventures in Paris. Grandpa mostly stayed quiet, occasionally nodding off, then jerking awake again. During dessert, an elaborate tiramisu that Mom announced she'd learned to make in her recent cooking class in Italy, Grandpa suddenly became more alert. He looked around the table as if seeing everyone for the first time that evening. "Charlotte," he said loudly, cutting through Aunt Margaret's story about her gallery's newest exhibition. "How's that house I got you? The one on Maple Street? Cost me nearly $500,000. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me, then to Mom, who had frozen with her wine glass halfway to her lips. "What house, Grandpa?" I asked, my heartbeat accelerating. "The house. The big Victorian with the blue shutters. Bought it for you 6 years ago when you got married. $480,000. Good investment, though. Probably worth more now. $480,000 is a lot to give one grandchild. Dad," Aunt Margaret muttered, her eyes narrowing as she looked at my mother. I stared at Mom, whose face had gone chalk white. She set down her glass with a shaking hand. "Dad's confused," she said quickly. "Charlotte, your grandfather's memory isn't what it used to be. Remember what the doctor said about not contradicting him? Just play along." But Grandpa Jack wasn't having it. "I'm not confused about this. Got the paperwork right in my desk at home. Janet handled everything since you were busy with wedding plans." "She didn't tell you?" Should have been a nice surprise. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I felt Kyle's hand find mine under the table. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is Grandpa talking about?" My mother laughed nervously. "Dad's just confused about timing. We've been looking into investment properties, something you might inherit someday. He's mixing things up," but Uncle Richard was now fully engaged. "Jack, are you saying you gave Charlotte money for a house? When was this?" 6 years ago, Grandpa insisted. "Around Christmas. Charlotte always wanted one of those Victorian houses like mine. Found one coming on the market and snatched it up. Janet said she'd handle the paperwork. Make it a surprise for after the honeymoon." I felt sick. Kyle and I had returned from our budget honeymoon to our tiny apartment 6 years ago. We'd been scrimping and saving for a house down payment ever since. "Mom?" I looked directly at her. Is this true? Did Grandpa buy me a house? Of course not, she snapped, but her voice had risen an octave. Dad's confused. This is ridiculous. Then why are you sweating in December, Janet? Aunt Margaret asked quietly. The conversation exploded after that. Uncle Richard demanded to know if Janet had been keeping secrets about Grandpa's gifts. Aunt Margaret started listing suspicious instances when Mom had intercepted Grandpa's generosity. Meanwhile, my mother grew increasingly defensive, eventually shouting that everyone was ruining Christmas with wild accusations. Throughout it all, Kyle sat beside me, silent but supportive. When I finally found my voice again, the question came out raw and hurt. Mom, have you been keeping my inheritance from me while watching me struggle? Her answer changed everything. You weren't ready for that kind of responsibility. You and Kyle would have wasted it on frivolous things. I was protecting you. The admission hung in the air. She hadn't denied it, she'd justified it. Kyle stood up first. I think we need to go, Charlotte. In a daze, I kissed Grandpa's forehead, ignoring my mother's pleas to be reasonable and discuss this privately. As Kyle led me to our car, I heard the argument continuing inside, my mother's voice rising hysterically above the others. The drive home was silent except for my occasional sobs. Kyle kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other tightly gripping mine. She stole from me, I finally whispered as our apartment building came into view. My own mother. We're going to figure this out, Kyle promised. Tomorrow, we start digging. I nodded, not yet comprehending how deep the deception would go, or how completely it would shatter the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my family. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My mind kept replaying Grandpa's words, Mom's defensive reaction, and the realization that for years I'd been struggling unnecessarily. Kyle and I had eaten ramen noodles for a week straight when our car needed repairs. We'd postponed starting a family because we couldn't afford childcare. I'd worked myself to exhaustion at jobs I hated, all while my house sat somewhere, possibly generating income for my mother. By 7 a.m. on Christmas morning, while most families were opening presents, I was hunched over our laptop, searching property records in our county. Kyle brought me coffee, then sat beside me, his teaching skills proving useful as we navigated the complex database. Try searching by your name, he suggested. If Grandpa put the house in your name, it should show up. Nothing appeared under Charlotte Bennett, which briefly made me wonder if Grandpa truly was confused. Then Kyle had another idea. What about your maiden name? Try Charlotte Parker. There it was. A property transaction dated December 18th, 6 years earlier. A Victorian home on Maple Street, purchased for $480,000 by Jack Bennett, with ownership transferred to Charlotte Parker. The current tax records, however, listed the owner as Janet Bennett, my mother. She forged my signature, I whispered, staring at the digital copy of the deed transfer. The signature that supposedly belonged to me was clearly in my mother's handwriting. I'd seen it on countless school permission slips and birthday cards throughout my life. Kyle squeezed my shoulder. This is illegal, Charlotte. She committed fraud. We kept digging. The property tax history showed the house had been rented out for the past 5 years. Based on comparable rentals in the area, my mother had likely been collecting around $2,800 monthly over $165,000 in rental income that should have been mine. We need to find the tenants, Kyle said. They might have records of who they've been paying. Through social media, we located the current renters, the Wilson family. I messaged them cautiously, explaining I was researching a family property matter. Mrs. Wilson responded almost immediately, confirming they rented the Blue Victorian on Maple Street and had been there for 3 years. We pay Janet Bennett, she wrote. Is everything okay? We've been having some maintenance issues she's been slow to address. I assured her everything was fine, then asked if she might share any communication she'd had with my mother. Within an hour, Mrs. Wilson had emailed copies of their lease agreement and recent maintenance requests, including water damage from a leaking roof that had gone unaddressed for months. By mid-afternoon, we had enough evidence to confront my mother. My phone had been buzzing with her messages since we'd left dinner the previous night, alternating between angry demands that I stop overreacting and tearful pleas to keep family matters private. I called her, putting the phone on speaker so Kyle could hear. "We need to talk about the house on Maple Street," I said without preamble. There was a long pause before she responded. "You've been snooping." "It's not snooping when it's my property. Why did you forge my signature? Why have you been collecting rent money that should have been mine?" "You weren't ready for that kind of responsibility," she snapped. "You were 26, just married to a teacher of all things. You'd have wasted Grandpa's gift." "That wasn't your decision to make," I was shouting now. "Kyle and I have been struggling for years while you've been collecting thousands in rent from MY House. I was protecting you from yourself." She wasn't even denying it anymore. "I invested that money. It's grown substantially. I was going to give it to you eventually, when you showed more financial maturity." "When, Mom? When we're 50? After we've spent our lives struggling to pay off student loans that we could have cleared immediately? After we postponed having children because we couldn't afford it?" Her voice turned cold. "I see you've made up your mind to be ungrateful. Fine. Come by tomorrow, and we'll discuss this rationally." But when we arrived at her house the next day, the discussion was anything but rational. Mom had prepared spreadsheets showing how she'd invested my rental income, but when I asked for copies, she refused. When I mentioned potential legal action, she laughed. "You'd sue your own mother? Over money? Who do you think a judge would believe, you or me? I have power of attorney over your grandfather's affairs." Everything was done legally, except for forging my signature, Kyle pointed out quietly. Mom glared at him. "Stay out of this. You've never been good enough for Charlotte anyway, always dragging her down with your modest ambitions." That was the last straw. No one spoke to my husband that way, especially not the person who'd been stealing from us for years. As we left, I turned to her one last time. "This isn't just about the house anymore, Mom. I want to know everything. Every gift from Grandpa you've kept from me." Her expression confirmed my suspicions before she even spoke. "You have no idea what you're doing, Charlotte. Some things are better left alone." That evening, Kyle and I combed through old bank statements and gift records. We found regular deposits to my childhood savings account that had mysteriously stopped when I turned 18, right when Mom took over as the account custodian. We found references to stock certificates Grandpa had purchased in my name that I'd never received. A trust fund mentioned in birthday cards that I'd never had access to. By our calculations, beyond the house and rental income, Mom had withheld at least another $170,000 in gifts and investments over the years. The total amount stolen from me was over $650,000. "We need to tell your grandfather," Kyle said gently. "He deserves to know what Janet has done with his gifts." I nodded, dreading the conversation, but knowing it was necessary. The next day, we would visit Grandpa Jack at his assisted living facility and shatter his trust in his daughter. The thought made me sick, but keeping silent would only allow Mom's deception to continue. Before going to bed, I checked my phone one last time. 3 missed calls from Mom, and a text message that simply read, "Don't you dare tell your grandfather. You have no idea what you're messing with." But I did know. I was messing with years of lies, manipulation, and theft. And I was finally ready to expose the truth, no matter how painful the consequences might be. The assisted living facility where Grandpa Jack lived was decorated with New Year's streamers when Kyle and I arrived the next day. Holiday music played softly in the common area where some residents were playing cards, but we headed straight for Grandpa's private room in the memory care wing. I found him sitting in his favorite armchair by the window, a photo album open on his lap. His face brightened when he saw me. "Charlotte!" And Kyle. What a nice surprise. He gestured to the album. "Just looking at old pictures. Remember that summer we went fishing at Lake Geneva?" I sat on the ottoman near his feet, taking his weathered hand in mine. "I remember, Grandpa. You taught me how to bait my own hook." For a few minutes, we reminisced about happier times, with Grandpa surprisingly lucid and detailed in his recollections. Then, gathering my courage, I broached the real reason for our visit. "Grandpa, I need to ask you about something important. Do you remember mentioning a house at Christmas dinner? A house you bought for me on Maple Street?" His brow furrowed in concentration, the Victorian with blue shutters. "Of course I remember. Your grandmother always loved those old Victorians. When I saw it coming on the market, I thought of you right away." "Grandpa," I said gently, "I never received that house. Mom never told me about it. He stared at me, confusion giving way to understanding. That can't be right. Janet handled everything. The paperwork, the transfer. He trailed off, then his eyes widened. You mean you've never lived there, all this time? I shook my head, fighting back tears. Mom kept it. She's been renting it out and collecting the income. We found the property records yesterday. For a moment, Grandpa Jack looked every bit his 85 years, the betrayal visibly aging him before my eyes. Then something hardened in his expression, a glimpse of the shrewd businessman he'd once been. Get me my phone, he said firmly. And my address book. We're calling a family meeting. Today, 3 hours later, the entire Bennett family gathered in the private dining room of the assisted living facility. Grandpa Jack sat at the head of the table, more commanding in his wheelchair than he'd been in months. Mom arrived last, her face tight with anger when she saw me. What is this about? She demanded, refusing to sit. Sit down, Janet, Grandpa said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Charlotte has brought some concerning information to my attention. I'd like to hear your explanation. Mom glanced around the table at Uncle Richard and Aunt Margaret, at my cousins, at Kyle, and me, then back to Grandpa. Dad, you're not well. Charlotte has been filling your head with ridiculous accusations because she's jealous of her cousin's success. The accusations aren't ridiculous if they're true, I countered, sliding copies of the property records across the table. You forged my signature to transfer the house Grandpa bought for me into your name. You've been collecting rent for years while watching Kyle and me struggle. Aunt Margaret gasped, snatching up the documents. Uncle Richard leaned over her shoulder to read them, his expression darkening. Janet, tell me this isn't true, he said. Mom's laugh was brittle. This is absurd. Dad asked me to manage his gifts to the grandchildren. I've been investing Charlotte's portion for her future. She's too impulsive to manage that kind of money. That wasn't your decision to make, Grandpa said quietly. I bought that house specifically for Charlotte and Kyle to live in, not as an investment property. And what about my trust fund? Uncle Richard suddenly asked. The one Dad set up for my medical school expenses that mysteriously had administrative errors when I tried to access it? Did you manage that too, Janet? The color drained from Mom's face. That was different, was it? Aunt Margaret joined in. Because I've always wondered about the art collection Dad promised for my gallery that never materialized. You were handling those purchases too, if I recall. As accusations flew around the table, I watched my mother's carefully constructed facade crumbling. She attempted justifications, then denials, then tearful pleas about being unappreciated for her financial acumen. But with each revelation, her position weakened. My cousins Jessica and Jennifer exchanged looks before Jessica hesitantly spoke up. Aunt Janet, did our graduation gifts from Grandpa ever arrive? You said you'd hold them for us until we finished college. And my study abroad funds? Nathan added. Grandpa mentioned setting aside $20,000, but you told me he changed his mind. Tom, my mother's husband and my father, had been silent until now. He turned to her, horror dawning on his face. Janet, what have you done? Have you been stealing from your entire family? I haven't stolen anything, Mom shouted, slamming her hand on the table. I've been protecting this family from their own financial incompetence. Dad trusted me to manage things properly. I trusted you to deliver my gifts as intended, Grandpa Jack said, his voice trembling with emotion. Not to hoard them for yourself while your family struggled. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Mom threatened to leave, then tried emotional manipulation, then finally issued an ultimatum to me. Drop this witch hunt now, or don't consider yourself my daughter anymore. In the stunned silence that followed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. If being your daughter means accepting your theft and lies, then I guess I'm not your daughter anymore. She stormed out, my father hesitating before following her with an apologetic glance back at me. The remaining family sat in shocked silence until Grandpa Jack cleared his throat. I think, he said slowly, we need to conduct a full audit of all the gifts and trusts I've established over the years. Richard, can you contact my attorney? Margaret, I'll need your help going through my records. He turned to me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Charlotte, I am so sorry. I never imagined Janet would betray all of us this way. I squeezed his hand. It's not your fault, Grandpa. But as we left the facility that evening, I could see the toll the revelation had taken on him. His shoulders hunched, his gaze distant. He looked broken in a way that had nothing to do with physical health. Kyle drove us home in silence. When we finally spoke, it was to acknowledge the painful truth neither of us wanted to face. "This could kill him," I whispered. "The stress, the betrayal." Kyle nodded grimly. "But letting your mother continue stealing from everyone would be worse." That night, I received text messages from cousins I hadn't been close to in years, all expressing shock and solidarity. Uncle Richard called to suggest we hire a forensic accountant as a group. Aunt Margaret left a tearful voicemail apologizing for not seeing the signs sooner. My phone remained conspicuously silent from my parents, but the family I thought I knew had already been shattered beyond recognition. Whatever came next, there was no going back to the way things were before. Have you ever had that gut-wrenching moment when you realized someone you trusted completely had betrayed you? The moment when your whole world shifts on its axis? If you've been through family betrayal, drop a comment below. I never imagined that fighting for what was rightfully mine would tear my family apart, but sometimes the truth hurts before it heals. January arrived with a flurry of legal consultations and emotional exhaustion. On the recommendation of Uncle Richard, I met with Amanda Harris, an attorney specializing in financial fraud and elder abuse. Her office was warm and inviting, but her assessment of our case was bluntly pragmatic. "You have clear evidence of fraud in the house transfer," she said, reviewing the documents we'd gathered. "The statute of limitations hasn't expired on that. The older gifts and trusts will be more challenging to recover, especially without proper documentation." "What about criminal charges?" Kyle asked. Amanda's expression was grave. "That's possible, especially given the forged signatures. But you need to consider whether you want to see your mother face potential jail time." The question haunted me in the weeks that followed. Did I want my mother punished? Or did I just want what was rightfully mine? The legal fees were already stretching our budget thin. Amanda had agreed to a partial contingency arrangement, but we still needed to pay filing fees and investigation costs. "We can use our emergency fund," Kyle suggested one night as we reviewed our finances. "This qualifies as an emergency, if anything does." I nodded, feeling guilty about depleting the small safety net we'd worked so hard to build. Kyle must have sensed my hesitation. "Charlotte, this is an investment in justice. In our future? We've been robbed for years. It's time to set things right." My mother, meanwhile, had launched her own offensive. First came the tearful phone calls to extended family members, painting herself as the victim of my greed and ingratitude. Then came attempts to turn Grandpa against me, suggesting I was manipulating him in his vulnerable state. When those tactics failed, she resorted to more direct threats. "If you pursue this, I'll contest Dad's will when the time comes," she warned during one of our attorney-advised communications. "I'll make sure this drags through the courts for years. Is that what you want?" The psychological toll was immense. I began having anxiety attacks before work, my performance suffering as I struggled to concentrate. Kyle, always my rock, shouldered extra responsibilities at home, but I could see the stress affecting him too. We fought more frequently, usually over trivial matters that masked the deeper strain we were under. "Maybe we should pause the legal proceedings," I suggested after a particularly bad week where I'd nearly lost a major client due to a panic-induced error. Just until things settled down, Kyle looked up from grading papers at our kitchen table. "Is that what you really want? Or is that your mother's voice in your head telling you to give up?" He was right. Throughout my life, Mom had conditioned me to doubt myself, to believe I couldn't handle responsibility or make sound decisions. Even now, with clear evidence of her betrayal, part of me still heard her criticisms echoing in my thoughts. Support came from unexpected places. My cousins, once distant due to what I now recognized as my mother's deliberate divisiveness, rallied around me. Jessica and Jennifer invited me for coffee, sharing their own stories of financial manipulation at the hands of my mother. "She told us you didn't want to be close with us," Jessica admitted, "that you thought our lifestyle was shallow." "She told me the same about you," I replied, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Nathan revealed that Aunt Janet had discouraged him from inviting me to his graduation. "She said you were jealous of my opportunities, and it would be uncomfortable for everyone." The pattern was clear. My mother had systematically isolated me from family support while presenting herself as my only advocate. The realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. Through persistent research, we discovered another devastating truth. Mom had a gambling problem. It had started small, occasional trips to casinos that Dad dismissed as harmless entertainment. But according to financial records Uncle Richard had accessed through his position at the family business, those trips had increased in frequency and expense over the years. "She's been bleeding money at riverboat casinos for nearly a decade," Uncle Richard explained, showing us credit card statements that confirmed regular ATM withdrawals at gambling establishments. I confronted Tom about it years ago, but he insisted Janet had it under control. This discovery explained the urgency behind Mom's financial manipulations, but didn't excuse them. If anything, it made me angrier that she'd stolen my inheritance to fund an addiction while watching me struggle. Amanda advised documenting everything meticulously. "Financial abuse cases are won with paper trails," she explained. "Every bank statement, every email, every text message could be crucial evidence." So I became an archivist of my own victimization, creating spreadsheets, tracking every gift Grandpa had intended for me, every dollar of rent collected from the house, every investment return that should have been mine. The process was emotionally draining but necessary. The stress began manifesting physically. I lost weight, developed insomnia, and started experiencing migraine headaches for the first time in my life. Kyle gently suggested therapy, and though initially resistant, I eventually agreed. Dr. Melissa Tanner specialized in family trauma. During our sessions, she helped me recognize the patterns of financial abuse that had been present throughout my life. "Your mother's control wasn't just about money," she explained. "It was about power. By keeping you financially dependent, she maintained control over your choices, your future, even your self-image." This perspective helped me understand why confronting Mom's betrayal felt so fundamentally destabilizing. It wasn't just about the stolen house or money. It was about reclaiming my autonomy, my right to make my own decisions without manipulation or sabotage. As the legal proceedings progressed, I reached out to several friends I'd lost touch with over the years. Many had tried to warn me about my mother's controlling behavior, only to be dismissed or pushed away. Reconnecting with them provided vital emotional support during the darkest moments of the legal battle. My friend Rachel, whom I hadn't spoken to in nearly 4 years, confessed over lunch. "Your mom always found subtle ways to undermine our friendship. She'd mention how I was a bad influence on your financial habits whenever I visited. She did the same with all my friends," I realized, especially the ones who encouraged me to be more independent. The first court hearing was scheduled for March. Mom arrived with her own attorney, a silver-haired man with an intimidating reputation. She refused to look at me, keeping her gaze fixed straight ahead as the proceedings began. When called to testify about the house transfer, she delivered the performance of a lifetime. "I was acting in my daughter's best interest," she insisted, voice trembling with manufactured emotion. Charlotte and Kyle weren't ready for home ownership. I was holding it in trust for them, managing it responsibly until they demonstrated financial stability. "And the rental income?" Amanda asked. "Where did that go?" "Into investments for Charlotte's future." "Can you provide documentation of these investments?" Mom hesitated, then replied, "The records are incomplete. I didn't expect my own daughter to sue me over a misunderstanding." I sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clenched so tightly my nails left marks on my palms. The misunderstanding had cost Kyle and me years of financial security. It had delayed our dreams of starting a family, forced us to live paycheck to paycheck, and left us wondering how we'd ever afford retirement. The judge ordered my mother to produce all financial records related to the property within 30 days. It was a small victory, but an important one. As we left the courthouse, Kyle squeezed my hand. "One step at a time," he whispered. "We're going to get through this." I nodded, trying to believe him. Even as I caught sight of my mother glaring at me from across the parking lot, a look of pure hatred that sent chills down my spine. This battle was far from over, and I was beginning to understand just how far my mother would go to maintain her web of lies. April brought spring flowers, renewed energy, and a discovery that changed everything. While helping Grandpa Jack sort through his personal effects at the assisted living facility, a task he'd insisted on doing himself despite his health challenges, I found a key to a storage unit I didn't know existed. "That's where I keep the important stuff," Grandpa explained vaguely. Things I didn't want to get lost in the move. The following weekend, Kyle and I visited the climate-controlled storage facility. Unit 227 was packed with furniture, photo albums, and dozens of labeled boxes. In the back corner, we found a fireproof safe containing legal documents, old stock certificates, and a collection of leather-bound journals spanning decades. "Your grandmother started keeping these," Grandpa had told me when I called to ask about them. I continued after she passed. "Helps me remember things clearly." I brought the journals home, and what I read over the next few days shook the foundation of everything I understood about my family. The earliest journals, written in my grandmother's delicate handwriting, documented an alarming pattern. My mother's financial manipulation had begun long before I was born. Janet took $500 from my purse again, read an entry from 1,979. Claims she knows nothing about it. Jack wants to believe her, but this is the third time this month. Later entries detailed more sophisticated schemes. Intercepted checks, borrowed jewelry that was never returned, unexplained withdrawals from joint accounts. My grandmother's frustrated entries revealed she had confronted my mother repeatedly, only to be gaslighted or dismissed. After my grandmother's death, Grandpa's entries continued the documentation. A particularly disturbing entry from 1,995, when I was just 3 years old, read, "Janet insists on being named custodian of Charlotte's college fund. Says Tom agrees it's best. Something feels wrong, but I don't want another family argument. Perhaps I'm just being paranoid after what happened with Elizabeth's jewelry." The most shocking revelation came from an entry dated shortly after my 18th birthday. "Janet convinced me Charlotte doesn't want access to her trust fund yet. Says she's too immature, wants to wait until after college." Not what Charlotte told me last week, but Janet insists she's changed her mind. Something doesn't add up. It wasn't just me. The journals documented similar patterns with Uncle Richard and Aunt Margaret, though they had apparently been more successful at protecting their own interests as adults. The evidence was clear. My mother had been engaging in financial abuse for her entire adult life, starting with her own parents. Armed with this new understanding, I reached out to my estranged father, Michael Parker. My parents had divorced when I was 12, and contact with Dad had become increasingly sporadic afterward, something Mom had attributed to his lack of interest in parenting. Now I wondered if there was more to the story. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes. Dad looked older than I remembered, his hair now more gray than brown, but his smile was just as warm. After awkward small talk, I broached the real reason for our meeting. "Dad, I'm dealing with some difficult discoveries about Mom and money. I need to understand why you really left." He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I suddenly realized I'd inherited. "I've waited years for this conversation, Charlotte. I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because your mother's financial manipulation became unbearable." The story he shared aligned perfectly with what I'd learned from the journals. Mom had controlled every aspect of their finances during their marriage, insisting on managing all accounts. When Dad received a substantial promotion at work, she immediately took control of the increased income, providing him with a strict allowance that didn't change despite their improved circumstances. "The breaking point came when I discovered she'd been opening credit cards in my name," he explained. "I was suddenly responsible for tens of thousands in debt I knew nothing about. When I confronted her, she threatened to tell the court I was abusive if I sought custody of you in a divorce." "Why didn't you fight for me?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for 20 years. "I tried, Charlotte. For 3 years, I fought through the courts. Your mother fabricated evidence, manipulated court-appointed evaluators, and drained my finances with legal delays. She told you I had visitation rights I never showed up for. But the truth is, she obtained emergency orders blocking my access repeatedly, then let them expire without telling me." He pulled out his phone, showing me a folder of scanned legal documents, years of court filings, motions, and appeals. "I've kept everything, hoping someday you'd be ready for the truth." We both cried that afternoon, mourning the relationship we'd lost to my mother's machinations. Before we parted, Dad shared one final revelation. After the divorce, I hired a private investigator. He found evidence your mother had offshore accounts where she was hiding family money. I provided everything to my attorney, but without your grandfather's cooperation, there wasn't much we could do. Janet had convinced him I was just being vindictive. This information proved invaluable to our legal case. Amanda immediately filed motions to expand the scope of financial discovery, specifically targeting potential offshore holdings. Within weeks, the forensic accountant Uncle Richard had uncovered 3 accounts in the Cayman Islands, containing over $1.2 million money that had been systematically siphoned from family accounts, including my inheritance. When confronted with this evidence during a deposition, Mom's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. "Everyone acts like I'm the villain," she snapped after being questioned about the accounts. "I was the only one who understood money in this family. Jack made his fortune but had no idea how to protect it. I did what was necessary." "By stealing from your daughter?" Amanda asked. "I was preparing for Charlotte's future. She's always been irresponsible with money, just like her father. Is gambling away stolen funds your idea of responsible financial management, Mrs. Bennett?" The question hit its mark. Mom's face went blank, then crumpled. For the first time, I glimpsed the scared, desperate woman beneath the manipulative exterior, someone whose relationship with money had become so distorted it had consumed her humanity. I felt no satisfaction in her breakdown, only a profound sadness for what could have been. That evening, I shared this feeling with Kyle as we sat on our apartment balcony. "I keep thinking about who I might have been without all this financial stress," I admitted. "Would I have pursued a different career? Would we have started a family already? It's like she stole more than money, she stole possibilities." Kyle took my hand. "We can't change the past, but we can reclaim our future. Whatever the outcome of the legal case, we're breaking the cycle. That's what matters most." Meanwhile, Grandpa Jack's health was deteriorating rapidly. The stress of discovering Janet's betrayal had affected him deeply, and a mild heart attack in May had further compromised his strength. During my next visit, he asked me to bring the family journals. "I should have seen it sooner," he said, patting the worn leather covers. "Your grandmother did. She documented everything, tried to warn me, but Janet was always so convincing. And I wanted to believe the best of my daughter." He handed me another journal I hadn't seen before, my grandmother's last one, kept in his bedside table rather than storage. "Read the last entry," he instructed. In shaking handwriting dated shortly before her death, my grandmother had written, "If something happens to me, protect Charlotte. Janet will try to control her inheritance just as she's tried to control everything else. Don't let history repeat itself." Tears slid down my cheeks as I realized my grandmother had foreseen exactly what would happen. Grandpa squeezed my hand, his own eyes wet. "I failed, Elizabeth, and I failed you. But we can still make this right." With renewed determination, I threw myself into building our case, working closely with Amanda, the forensic accountant, and family members who had finally united against my mother's deception. Each new discovery reinforced what the journals had revealed. This wasn't just about a house or money. It was about decades of calculated manipulation designed to maintain power and fund my mother's secret addiction. The question now wasn't just whether we would win the legal battle, but whether any of us could truly heal from the damage that had been done. As the court date for final arguments approached, I found myself not just fighting for financial justice, but for a chance to reclaim the family narrative that had been distorted for so long. The courthouse steps were slick with June rain as Kyle and I arrived for the final hearing. 6 months of legal battles had led to this moment, the judge's ruling on my case against my mother. Uncle Richard and Aunt Margaret waited inside, having become unexpected allies throughout this ordeal. Even my father had flown in from Arizona to show support. My mother and her attorney arrived last, neither acknowledging our presence as they swept past. Despite everything, my stomach still knotted at the sight of her, the instinctive reaction of a daughter seeing her mother, regardless of the harm done. Judge Eleanor Winters, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, called the court to order promptly at 9 a.m. The courtroom fell silent as she reviewed the case files one last time before speaking. This court has reviewed extensive evidence regarding the property at 1428 Maple Street and related financial matters, she began. The documentation clearly establishes that the property was purchased by Jack Bennett as a gift for his granddaughter, Charlotte Bennett, and that Janet Bennett fraudulently transferred ownership to herself through forged documents. My heart pounded as Judge Winters continued, methodically outlining my mother's deception, the forged signatures, the intercepted gifts, the hidden offshore accounts, the years of rental income diverted for personal use. Furthermore, she added, the evidence supports claims that Janet Bennett systematically misappropriated funds intended for Charlotte Bennett over a period of years, totaling approximately $650,000 in gifts, investments, and rental income. Judge Winters removed her glasses, fixing my mother with a stern gaze. Mrs. Bennett, the court finds your actions constitute fraud, conversion of property, and breach of fiduciary duty. You are hereby ordered to immediately transfer ownership of the property at 1428 Maple Street to Charlotte Bennett, along with all related documentation. Additionally, you are ordered to repay the sum of $412,835 in misappropriated rental income and investment returns, plus legal fees of $78,500. A small gasp escaped me. We'd won, completely. Your Honor, my mother's attorney interjected. My client lacks the liquid assets to satisfy such a judgment immediately. The court is aware, Judge Winters replied. Mrs. Bennett will have 60 days to arrange payment, or the court will authorize seizure of assets, including the property at 214 Oak Avenue. My mother's home, the house where I'd grown up, could be taken to satisfy the judgment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. What happened next remains burned in my memory. My mother, always so controlled and calculating, completely broke down. She lurched to her feet, face contorted with rage and desperation. "This is outrageous," she shouted. "Everything I did was for this family. Charlotte wouldn't even know what to do with that kind of money. She's just like her father, irresponsible, ungrateful. Mrs. Bennett, control yourself or you'll be held in contempt," Judge Winters warned. But Mom was beyond warnings now, years of secrets and manipulation bursting forth like a ruptured dam. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed, what I've done to protect this family's legacy. Charlotte would have wasted everything." They all would have. Two court officers approached as she continued her tirade, eventually escorting her from the courtroom as she sobbed uncontrollably. The outburst left everyone shaken, especially me. Despite everything she'd done, seeing my mother reduced to such a state brought no satisfaction, only a hollow sadness for what our relationship had become. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, alerted by the public nature of the case and the prominent Bennett family name. Amanda skillfully fielded their questions while Kyle led me to our car, shielding me from the most aggressive photographers. "It's over," he whispered as we drove away. "You did it, Charlotte." But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the final death of the family I thought I had. The aftermath was complicated. Despite the court order, gaining actual control of my assets proved challenging. My mother had indeed drained many accounts before the judgment, transferring funds to unknown locations. The forensic accountants Uncle Richard had hired were still tracking down millions potentially hidden in international accounts. The house on Maple Street, my house, was finally transferred to my name in July. Kyle and I visited for the first time on a sweltering afternoon, meeting the Wilson family who had been renting it all these years. They were kind people who had suffered from my mother's neglect as a landlord, showing us water damage from the leaking roof and electrical problems that had never been properly addressed. "We'd like to stay, if possible," Mrs. Wilson said tentatively. "We love this house, despite its issues." Of course, I assured her, "We'll need some time to make proper repairs, but you're welcome to remain as our tenants." The irony wasn't lost on me. After fighting so hard for this property, my first action was to continue renting it out rather than moving in ourselves. But our apartment lease wasn't up for months, and the house needed significant work before it would be truly livable. More importantly, Kyle and I needed time to process everything before making such a major transition. The emotional toll of the legal battle had been immense, straining our relationship and draining our energy. We agreed to take a vacation, our first real one, since our honeymoon before making any big decisions. While we were away, news broke that changed everything again. My mother had filed for divorce from my father, Tom. After 35 years of marriage, he'd finally reached his breaking point when the full extent of her deception came to light. I knew about some of the financial issues, he admitted when he called to tell me. But I had no idea how far it went, Charlotte. The offshore accounts, the systematic theft from your grandfather, I swear I didn't know. I wanted to believe him. Part of me did. But another part wondered how he could have been so oblivious for so many years. Either way, he was yet another victim in my mother's web of deception. The divorce filing revealed another shock. Janet had drained their joint accounts before the court ruling, leaving my father with almost nothing. She'd also taken family heirlooms, including jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. Uncle Richard organized a family meeting at his home to discuss next steps. The mood was somber as we gathered around his dining room table. Richard and Aunt Deborah, Aunt Margaret and Uncle Steve, my cousins, Kyle and me, even my father Tom, looking shell-shocked and aged. The private investigators have traced some of the missing funds to accounts in Switzerland, Richard explained. But the legal process to recover those assets could take years and cost a fortune, Margaret added. What about criminal charges? Nathan asked. Shouldn't Aunt Janet face consequences beyond civil penalties? All eyes turned to me. Somehow, I'd become the de facto decision-maker regarding my mother's fate. I've spoken with the district attorney, I said quietly. They believe there's enough evidence for criminal fraud charges, but they wanted to know if the family supports prosecution. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the decision. Criminal charges meant public exposure, a trial, the possibility of my mother going to prison. Despite everything she'd done, the thought still felt wrong somehow. Grandpa Jack should have a say, I finally said. It's his money she stole first. His trust she betrayed before anyone else's. Richard nodded grimly. Dad's not doing well, Charlotte. The doctors say the stress has accelerated his decline. He's asking for you, though. The next day, I visited Grandpa at the hospital where he'd been admitted after a second, more serious heart attack. He looked frail in the hospital bed, monitors beeping softly beside him. When he saw me, he reached out a trembling hand. There's my girl, he whispered, my Charlotte. I sat beside him, carefully holding his hand with its paper-thin skin and prominent veins. We talked about the court case, about the house, about the funds still missing. When I broached the subject of criminal charges, he closed his eyes. No prison, he finally said. Janet needs help, not punishment. Make that the condition she gets treatment for the gambling, makes amends however she can. But I don't want my daughter in prison, no matter what she's done. His wishes were clear, and despite mixed feelings from other family members, I honored them. Working with the district attorney, we arranged a deal. My mother would avoid criminal charges if she entered treatment for gambling addiction, participated in financial restitution to the extent possible, and agreed to psychological counseling. To everyone's surprise, she accepted the terms. Perhaps hitting rock bottom had finally broken through her denial, or perhaps she simply preferred this option to prison. Either way, by late August, she had checked into a residential treatment facility specializing in addiction and financial disorders. The family gathered one last time that summer, for a much different purpose than our usual celebrations. Grandpa Jack, released from the hospital but still weak, had requested a family dinner at his room in the assisted living facility. It was a bittersweet occasion, the first family gathering without my mother present, and likely the last one Grandpa would attend, given his declining health. As we shared a meal catered by his favorite restaurant, Grandpa raised a toast with his glass of apple juice. To honesty, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, and to healing. May this family learn from its mistakes and grow stronger through its pain. We all drank to that, though none of us were quite sure what healing would look like after such profound betrayal. For me, at least, the path forward was becoming clearer. Kyle and I would renovate the house on Maple Street and make it our home at last. We would use part of the recovered funds to pay off our student loans and establish a secure financial foundation. And we would finally start trying for the family we'd postponed for so long. As summer faded into fall, I I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for financial security, but for emotional healing as well. The wounds left by my mother's betrayal would take much longer to heal than any legal battle. But for the first time, I believed healing was possible. 1 year after the fateful Christmas Eve dinner that changed everything, Kyle and I finally moved into the Victorian house on Maple Street. The renovation had taken months, replacing the leaking roof, updating the electrical system, refinishing the hardwood floors hidden under years of neglect. But as we carried the last box through the front door on a crisp December morning, the house finally felt like ours. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thompson," Kyle said, using my married name as he swept me into his arms and carried me over the threshold. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. The Wilsons had found another rental in September, sending us a kind note thanking us for the repairs we'd made during their final months as tenants. We'd parted on good terms. Another small healing in a year filled with painful breaks and careful mendings. Grandpa Jack had lived just long enough to see justice done. He passed away peacefully in October, surrounded by family in his room at the assisted living facility. His final weeks had been focused on reconciliation and setting right what had gone wrong, including establishing a family trust with transparent rules and multiple trustees to prevent any single person from controlling the assets. "Learn from my mistakes, Charlotte," he'd told me during one of our last conversations. "Money matters, but trust matters more. Build systems that don't rely on blind faith, even in those you love most." The trust he established included funds for all his grandchildren, divided equally and protected by legal safeguards he insisted on despite his weakened state. He also set aside money for my mother, contingent on her completing treatment and maintaining recovery, a final act of conditional love that acknowledged both her betrayal and his hope for her redemption. My mother had completed her initial 90-day treatment program and moved into a halfway house. Our relationship remained fragile and distant, conducted mainly through carefully worded emails and occasional supervised visits. The therapist who facilitated our first post-treatment meeting had explained that rebuilding trust might take years if it happened at all. "Your boundaries are healthy," she assured me when I expressed guilt about keeping my mother at arm's length. "Janet needs to earn back trust through consistent actions over time. That's part of her recovery." For her part, Mom seemed changed by her time in treatment. More humble, less manipulative, willing to acknowledge at least some of the harm she had caused. During our last meeting, she'd looked at me with clear eyes free from their usual calculation. "I can't undo what I've done, Charlotte," she said, "but I'm trying to understand why I did it." The therapists say my relationship with money became distorted early on, that I used financial control as a substitute for the emotional security I never had. "It doesn't excuse anything, but maybe it explains some of it." I nodded, not ready to offer forgiveness, but willing to listen. It was a starting point, if nothing else. My father, Tom, had moved to a small apartment across town, starting over at 60, with the resilience I'd always admired in him. We met for dinner regularly now, rebuilding our relationship one conversation at a time. He and Kyle had developed an unexpected friendship, bonding over shared interests I'd never known they had. Uncle Richard and Aunt Margaret had become constants in our lives, stopping by regularly to see the house renovations and share family meals. My cousins, once distant strangers made so by my mother's manipulations, were now friends and allies. We'd even started a family book club that met monthly, catching up on each other's lives while discussing literature. The recovered funds, those we could trace and reclaim, had been life-changing. Kyle and I had paid off our student loans, completed the house renovation, and established an emergency fund that would prevent the kind of financial precarity we'd lived with for years. But the most meaningful use of the money came from an unexpected inspiration. "I want to start a foundation," I told Kyle one evening as we sat on our new porch swing, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in gold, "for victims of financial abuse. Most resources focus on physical or emotional abuse, but financial control can be just as devastating." Kyle, always my biggest supporter, immediately embraced the idea. We used a portion of the recovered funds to establish the Elizabeth Bennet Foundation, named after my grandmother, who had first documented the pattern of abuse in our family. The foundation provided grants for legal assistance, financial literacy training, and counseling services for people escaping financially controlling relationships. I drew on my marketing background to raise awareness about the signs of financial abuse, speaking at community centers and colleges about recognizing the red flags I'd missed for so long. As Christmas approached again, Kyle and I decided to host the family gathering at our house, establishing new traditions to replace the painful memories of the previous year. The dining room that had once been filled with tension and secrets would now welcome honest conversation and genuine connection. The morning of Christmas Eve brought another change to celebrate. After months of trying, a pregnancy test finally showed positive. As Kyle and I embraced, tears of joy streaming down both our faces, I felt the cycle of pain truly beginning to break. Our child would grow up in a home where money was discussed openly, where financial literacy was taught alongside values like honesty and compassion. That evening, as our family gathered around the table, Uncle Richard and Aunt Deborah, Aunt Margaret and Uncle Steve, my cousins, my father, even Kyle's parents who had driven in from Ohio, I looked around at the faces of those who had supported us through the darkest year of our lives. "Before we eat," I said, standing to offer a toast, "I want to thank each of you for being here. A year ago, I thought I'd lost my family forever. Today, I realize I found my true family, one built on honesty, support, and genuine love." Glasses clinked as murmurs of agreement circled the table. In that moment, I understood that while money had been the weapon that nearly destroyed us, it had never been the real issue. The true battle had been about honesty versus deception, control versus freedom, manipulation versus genuine care. Kyle squeezed my hand under the table, our secret joy, adding an extra layer of sweetness to the evening. Tomorrow, we would share our pregnancy news with everyone. Tonight was about acknowledging how far we'd all come. Later, after our guests had departed, and we sat alone beside our first Christmas tree in our new home, Kyle put his arm around me. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said quietly. "Of all of this," I nodded, thinking of Grandpa Jack and the values he'd tried to instill in me during those Sunday ice cream outings so long ago. Money is just a tool, not a treasure. The real treasure had always been the people around this table, the family we choose, the bonds we build through honesty and care. The house on Maple Street had finally served its intended purpose, not just as a physical home, but as the foundation for the life Kyle and I had always dreamed of building together. The journey to claim it had cost more than either of us could have imagined, but as I placed my hand over my stomach, feeling the future growing within, I knew we were exactly where we were meant to be. If you've followed my story this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts on family justice and healing after betrayal. Has karma ever caught up with someone who wronged you? Did you find that justice alone was enough? Or did you need more to truly heal? Drop a comment below and let me know. Don't forget to like and subscribe if my family's journey resonated with you, and share this with anyone who might be struggling with family financial manipulation. Sometimes the most important thing is knowing you're not alone. Thank you for being part of my healing journey. The support of this community means more than you know.